My grandfather's journals described a monster. Now it's outside my door by silent screams. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It's funny the things you inherit. My father left me a watch that never keeps the right time and a crippling fear of disappointing people. But my grandfather left me a prison. He just called it a cabin. I hadn't seen Elias Vance since I was 7 years old. He was a recluse, a ghost who lived in the deep folds of the Appalachian Mountains. A man my mother spoke of in hushed, strained tones. When the lawyer called to inform me I was the sole beneficiary of his estate, I pictured a dusty, forgotten bank account. I didn't picture 300 acres of primeval forest and a log cabin perched on a lonely mountainside, miles from the nearest anything. My plan was simple. Drive up, appraise the place, clear it out, and sell it. I'm a city person. My idea of wilderness is a park with a designated jogging path. When I first drove up the winding, neglected dirt road, carving through a tunnel of dense, whispering pines, I felt a knot of unease tighten in my stomach. The air itself felt heavy, ancient. The cabin was exactly as you'd imagine. Hand-hewn logs, a wide stone chimney, a porch that sagged like a weary sigh. Inside, it was a time capsule of a life lived in solitude. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, illuminating shelves of yellowed books, meticulously organized tools, and furniture built from the same dark wood that surrounded the property. It smelled of pine, wood smoke, and something else. Something faintly metallic and sad, like old blood or rust. I spent the first 2 days just cleaning, throwing out expired canned goods, boxing up clothes that were little more than rags. It was on the third day that I found the locked room. It was a small door at the back of the pantry, made of reinforced oak with an old, heavy iron lock. Curiosity got the better of me. After a solid hour of wrestling with a crowbar, the lock groaned and snapped. The room wasn't for storage. It was a study. A single, sturdy desk faced the room's only window, which was boarded up from the inside. And on that desk, stacked in neat chronological piles, were the journals. 27 of them bound in worn leather, filled with my grandfather's spidery, precise handwriting. Asterisk, I figured they might contain something of value, some clue as to why he'd lived like this. So that night, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the wind beginning to moan outside, I opened the first one. For the first few volumes, the entries were normal, mundane, even. He wrote about the weather, the patterns of the deer, the day he finished the porch, the taste of the water from the well. He was a keen observer, a man deeply in tune with his environment. His world was the valley, the trees, the creatures that lived within it. I felt like I was finally getting to know him. I felt a pang of regret that I never had. It was in the 5th journal, dated 15 years before his death, that the change began. It was subtle at first. October 12th, the nights are growing colder. There is a new sound in the valley. Not a bear, not a cat. It's a sound of grief. It comes from the ridge just after moonrise. A long, drawn-out cry that settles in the bones. I put the book down, a little unsettled. The wind was picking up, scraping tree branches against the roof. It was easy to see how loneliness could play tricks on an old man's mind. One kept reading. October 19th. It's closer tonight. I saw the tree line move, but there was no wind. Something tall passed behind the pines. Too tall, too thin. The deer have all gone. The forest is silent. It knows. His entries grew more sporadic, more frantic. Gave it a name. He called it the Griever. He described it as a tall, emaciated thing, pale as bone, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. He said it never fully showed itself, but he would see it at the edge of his vision. A flicker of white in the deep green, a shadow that moved against the grain of the others. I have to admit I laughed. It was absurd. A monster in the woods. It read like the ravings of a man descending into dementia, his isolation breeding boogeymen in the dark. I felt a wave of pity for him, dying alone up here with such terrors in his mind. I closed the journal and went to bed, convinced the only thing haunting these woods was profound loneliness. The next night, I learned how wrong I was. Asterisk, it started around midnight, a sound that pulled me from a deep sleep. It was a low, mournful cry that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't an animal. It was a sound of pure, bottomless sorrow, so profound it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It rose in pitch, a wail of utter despair that echoed through the valley, and then it was gone. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I lay there in the dark, straining my ears, telling myself it was the wind. It had to be the wind playing tricks in the chimney or the sound of a distant train. But there were no train tracks for 100 miles. And it was no wind. It was the sound my grandfather had described. The sound of grief. The next morning I tried to brush it off. Nerves. The power of suggestion from the journals. I decided to focus on my task. Getting the cabin ready to sell. I went out onto the porch to sweep, and I stopped dead, arranged in a perfect, straight line by the top step were 3 smooth gray river stones. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core that they hadn't been there the day before. Meticulous, I would have noticed. I kicked them off the porch, my boot making a hollow thud against the wood. It was probably just some kids, I told myself, a prank. But there were no kids out here. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles down the mountain. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair by the dying fire, a heavy iron poker in my hand, and I listened. The silence was absolute. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was the kind of unnatural silence my grandfather had written about, silence of prey, and then I saw it. Through the large window in the main room I was staring out, into the inky blackness of the tree line, maybe 100 yards away. For just a second, a patch of that darkness seemed to detach itself. It unfolded upwards, a long, pale sliver against the black trunks of the pines. It was impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, and then, again as quickly as it had appeared, it receded back into the gloom. I didn't scream. I didn't move, just sat there, my knuckles white on the poker, my breath a ragged mess in my chest. It wasn't dementia. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. Hannah was watching the cabin. Panic set in. Pure, undiluted terror. I had to get out. To hell with the cabin, the land, the money. The next morning, I threw my bags in my car, didn't even bother to lock the door, jammed the key in the ignition. Asterisk, nothing. It was dead. Completely dead. I'm no mechanic, but I popped the hood anyway. The battery cables had been severed, not chewed through by an animal. They were cut clean as if with shears. I was trapped. There was no cell service, of course. The landline in the cabin was dead. The wire outside snapped. My only option was to walk the 15 miles back to the main road. I grabbed a bottle of water and started down the dirt track, trying not to look at the trees, at the shadows that seemed to lengthen and twist as I passed. I hadn't gotten a mile before I found it. A massive pine tree, at least 4 feet in diameter, had fallen directly across the road. It wasn't an old rotten tree. It was green, healthy. The base of the trunk was a splintered, jagged mess. It hadn't fallen. It had been pushed. Sheer impossible force required to do that. I turned and ran back to the cabin. The only 4 walls between me and the suffocating wilderness. That night I didn't bother with the fire. I didn't want any light. I didn't want to see what was outside. I barricaded the door with a heavy bookcase and went straight for the journals. I had dismissed them as fiction, but now they were the only thing that might hold an answer. I skipped ahead, looking for the last entries. My hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages. The handwriting in the final volume was a mess, jagged. Desperate scrawls that dug into the paper. It knows the boy's coming. The line continues. It can feel the blood. My blood, thinned by time but still there. It hungers for it. It has been so long. The boy, he meant me. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, seeped into me. This wasn't random. It was connected to my family. To me, my ancestor Jonathan Vance did not build this cabin as a home. He built it as a cage. He made a pact in the old country, a deal for prosperity, for a safe passage to this new world. But the things you make deals with, they always collect. The price was stewardship. One of our blood must always remain here, not to keep it out, but to keep it in. It is bound to this valley, but the binding is tied to us. If the line vacates the land, the binding weakens. It will get out. God help us if it ever gets out. I felt the floor drop out from under me. This wasn't a haunting. It was a duty. A generational curse. My grandfather wasn't a crazy recluse. He was a warden, jailer. Annie had just passed the keys to me. He wrote about the Griever's nature. It fed on despair, on sorrow, on fear. That's why it wailed. It was projecting its own misery and drawing strength from the terror it sowed. He wrote that it could not enter the cabin unless the steward's will was broken. It would test the walls, test the mind, night after night after night. The ritual must be done. The salt, the iron, the offering, it is the only thing that reminds it of the old pact that placates its hunger for a time. It buys you peace, but never for long. It always returns. It always grieves. Asterisk, I jumped, dropping the book. My eyes shot to the front door, the heavy bookcase pressed against it. It was outside. My breath hitched. I could feel its presence, a palpable pressure against the cabin walls. A wave of suffocating despair washed over me, so potent I almost buckled. It was the creature broadcasting its eternal misery, trying to break me from the inside out. I had to fight it. I scrambled for the journal, my fingers finding the last hastily scrawled page. It was a list. Cellar, iron box, under the loose stone. Now, grabbed the oil lamp, my only light, and wrenched open the cellar door. The steep stone steps led down into a damp, earthy darkness. At the bottom I scanned the floor until I found it a single flagstone that was slightly askew. Prying it up with the crowbar revealed a small iron-strong box, all rusted with age. Inside was a leather pouch filled with coarse salt, a handful of old hand-forged iron nails, and a small silver locket. I opened the locket. On one side was a faded daguerreotype of a stern-looking man with my grandfather's eyes, Jonathan Vance, I presumed, and on the other was a single, tightly folded piece of paper. The instructions for the ritual. Asterisk, it was getting impatient. I read the instructions in the flickering lamplight. A line of salt across every threshold, every windowsill, iron nail driven into the frame of the front and back doors. And the offering. The offering had to be blood. A few drops from the steward smeared on the locket and placed on the porch. A reminder of the bloodline. A renewal of the pact. I worked with frantic haste, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I poured the salt, my hands trembling, trying not to leave any gaps. I hammered the ancient nails into the door frames, the sound echoing like gunshots in the terrifying silence. Asterisk, I cried out as one of the windows splintered, cracks spider webbing across the pane. It didn't break through, but it would. It was testing, pushing. I fumbled in my pocket for my pocket knife, the one I used to open boxes back in the city. My hand shook as I made a small, shallow cut on my palm. The blood welled up, dark in the lamplight. I smeared it across the face of the locket, the cool silver turning slick and warm. Now for the hardest part. I had to go outside. I dragged the bookcase away from the door, my muscles screaming in protest. The moaning from the other side was constant now, a symphony of torment. I took a deep breath, unlatched the deadbolt, and pulled the door open just wide enough to slip through. Cold hit me like a physical blow. The night was utterly black, but I didn't need to see. I could feel it. It was close. The air was thick with its sorrow, heavy with its ancient hunger. I could hear a faint, wet, clicking sound from the corner of the porch, from the deepest shadows. Didn't dare look. I squeezed my eyes shut, placed the locket on the top step, and scrambled back inside, slamming the heavy oak door shut and throwing the bolt. I leaned against it, gasping for air, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. The moaning stopped. The scraping stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it. A soft, inquisitive sniff from the other side of the door. It was followed by the delicate sound of the silver locket being picked up. Silence and an hour passed, then another. The oppressive feeling of despair slowly began to recede like a tide going out. The forest began to wake up. I heard the tentative chirp of a cricket, then the distant hoot of an owl. The unnatural silence had been broken. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the mountain ridge, I knew I had survived the night. The ritual had worked. It had accepted the offering. The pact was renewed. For now, I didn't try to leave again. I knew it was pointless. The car wouldn't be fixed. The tree would not be moved. This was my place now. This valley, this cabin, this curse. I was the new steward. It's been 6 months. I've read all the journals. I understand now. My grandfather wasn't just a warden, he was a chronicler. He was passing down the knowledge needed to survive. He was passing down the torch. I spend my days reinforcing the cabin, gathering supplies, and walking the property line, never going beyond the ancient stones that marked the valley's edge. And at night I sit at the desk where my grandfather sat, started my own journal, adding my experiences, my fears to the long, lonely history of my family. Sometimes weeks will go by in peace, but it always comes back. I'll hear that sorrowful wail echoing from the ridge, a reminder of what lurks in the trees. I'll find little gifts on the porch, a dead bird, a strangely shaped branch, a smooth river stone. Reminders of its presence, reminders of my duty I haven't seen it fully since that first night, but I know it's there. I can feel its eyes on me when I chop wood, a pale shape in my periphery, a shadow that moves too fast. It's watching. It's waiting for me to fail, to break, to forget the ritual, waiting for the day the bloodline ends and the binding finally shatters. My name is Jacob Vance. I am the last of my line, and I have inherited a prison. My life is no longer my own. I am the steward. It's falling.